Hey everybody. Listen, I'm so glad you're back. Today we're going to talk about research. And of course you know there's several types, but this video is about experiments because that's the most important type in psychology. So the other types, of course, case studies, which Freud was famous for doing. You could do naturalistic observation, you could do a survey, and you could do a correlation study. But we're talking about research. So today, first, I'm sorry, I said we're talking about research. We're talking about experiments, okay? Experiments. What is an experiment? An experiment is when a scientist or a psychologist, psychologists are scientists, when a psychologist manipulates one variable and measures a second variable and holds everything else constant. So if there's any change, you can tell that it's that one variable that did it because it's the only thing that was manipulated. So experiments are the only type of research that let you explain why a phenomena happens. You can say for sure when you do an experiment that this thing caused this other thing because you controlled all the variables except for one, the one thing you manipulated. So that one thing that you manipulated is called the independent variable. The independent variable, that's very important. It's the one you manipulate. The one you measured is called the dependent variable. So the dependent depends on the independent. But I think the easiest way, that was a little confusing, the easiest way to remember is that the independent is measured, the independent is manipulated, and the dependent is measured. Okay, I hope I didn't throw you off there. Actually, I'm confident that you'll be able to figure that out. So let's give you an example. Let's say that I wanted to know as a teacher, should I allow students to eat food? So my hypothesis would be that if they get to eat food in class, they'll do better on their tests. So I'm going to let half of my students, I've got about 100, I'm going to let half of them eat food during the test, and half of them I'm going to not let eat food. So I'm manipulating what? Food. I'm manipulating food. So food is the independent variable. What am I measuring? I'm measuring test scores. So test scores are the dependent variable. All right, you with me so far? Okay, good. So in that experiment, as in all experiments, there's two different groups of people. One group of people is getting the food and one is not. So the group that's getting the food in my little experiment is the experimental group. They're getting the independent variable. They're being manipulated. The group that doesn't get food is the control group. They're just status quo, nothing new. They're not getting the independent variable. So they're the control group because having the control group enables you to tell whether the independent variable did anything or not. All right. There's always a question on the A/B test where it gives you an example of an experiment and you have to identify independent, dependent, control, experimental group. So you need to know those four things for sure. Two other important things about an experiment that students often get confused about: random selection and random assignment. Okay, random selection, random assignment. So when I'm selecting who's going to be in my experiment, I've got 100 students and I'm only going to pick 50 of them. So 50 people are going to be in my experiment. I have to randomly select them. So I have to draw their names out of a hat. Out of 100 students, I'm going to draw 50 out of a hat. It's random selection. Now I got 50 people in my research. Once they're in, I have to decide who's going to be in the control group and who's going to be in the experimental group. How do I do that? Randomly. Random assignment. So putting them either into the control group or experimental group, that has to be done randomly, and that's called random assignment. Okay, so those two are confusing, but make sure you get those. There's something else, two more things when it comes to basic research like this. One thing is that my procedure has to be standardized. So standardized procedure means I do it the same for everybody. Every time I do a different subject, I do the exact same process. That's important to make sure that the research isn't sloppy so that I have a good finding. Also to prevent bias. So there's a possibility that I would be biased. So you want to standardize procedure to make sure that I'm not biased. Another reason you would have a standardized procedure is that, let's say I had some finding, I'm a psychologist and I discover something and I want other psychologists to know it, so I'm going to publish it in a scientific journal where they can read about it. In that journal, I'm going to write up the specific steps that I used in my research. So I'm going to write and describe my standardized procedure. Now, other scientists are going to see this and they're going to want to know, are my findings real? Are they legitimate? And so the process they're going to undertake is called replication. So replication means they're going to do my experiment over again based upon my description of the procedure. So why would they replicate? I already did the experiment. Why do they need to do it again? Well, they want to make sure that my findings are legitimate. So they might change my experiment slightly, or they might do it exactly the same. But if they get the same results that I got, then we could say my findings have been replicated and they're legitimate. So there's one type of study where people maybe are doing an experiment on medication. So let's say there's a new antidepressant medication that's been invented by a company, and that company wants to know, is it a legitimate drug or not? Does it work? So they're going to do an experiment, and there's a couple things that are going to be different. One is that they're going to use a placebo. A placebo. Okay? So what is a placebo? Well, I give 100 people my new drug, 100 people that are depressed, and I give 100 people the placebo. So it's a fake drug. So then these 200 people, they don't know which they got, the real drug or not. And so they can't fake any benefits or symptoms, or it's a way to control. So the group that gets the placebo is the control group. The group that gets the real drug is the experimental group. Now, when the people in that experiment don't know, they're blind. They're blind as to whether they got the placebo or the real drug. But a problem might be is that I, the experimenter, might be biased. And so if you want to make sure that my bias doesn't affect the results, you do what's called a double blind. So the participants are blind. They don't know who got the drug and who got the placebo. And the researcher is blind. I don't know who got the drug or the placebo. So when both groups are blind, that's two. That's a double blind. Okay. I don't know. I think if you know those things about experiment that I've just gone over in this video, that's a pretty good start to being really well prepared for the AP test and for my test in my class as well. So if you don't understand something in the video, feel free to check with me in class, and maybe I can help you out there. As for now, I'll talk to you later. If I can find out, where's the off button?